Mr. Robert Johnson sat in his cramped apartment in Riverside, California, surrounded by 4 decades of memories that told the story of a life dedicated to education. The walls were lined with photo albums, each one chronicling another year at Roosevelt High School. Graduation ceremonies, where he'd watched struggling students walk across the stage with pride. Science fair victories where his math tutoring had helped kids discover their potential, and countless thank you letters from former students who had gone on to achieve their dreams. The apartment itself was modest. A teacher's salary in California hadn't allowed for luxury. The furniture was old but well maintained, the carpet worn but clean. On his desk sat a calculator from 1984, still functional after all these years, much like Bob himself. "Dad, I can't believe you've never been on a plane," his daughter Lisa had said during their weekly phone call from her apartment in Manhattan. She was a successful marketing executive now, living the life Bob had always dreamed she could have. Bob chuckled, adjusting his reading glasses, as he looked at a photo of Lisa's high school graduation. "Honey, you know how it was. Between your college tuition, Mom's medical bills before she passed, and living on a teacher's salary, we could barely afford bus tickets to visit Grandma in San Diego. Flying was always something other people did. But Dad, you're retired now. You have some savings, right? You should see the world." Bob looked around his small apartment, then at the stack of bills on his kitchen table. Even in retirement, money was tight. His pension covered the basics, but luxuries like air travel had always seemed impossibly out of reach. "Well," he said slowly, "there is one trip I'd love to make." "What's that?" "I'd love to meet my grandson. Little Tommy is already 6 months old, and I've only seen him in photos." There was silence on the other end of the line, then Lisa's voice, thick with emotion. "Dad, I'm buying you a plane ticket right now. It's time you took your first flight." That conversation had been 2 weeks ago. Now Bob held the boarding pass in his trembling hands. Flight 447, LAX to JFK, his first airplane journey at the age of 67. Bob woke up at 4:30 a.m., 3 hours before his alarm was set to go off. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with excitement and nervousness about flying for the first time. He made his usual breakfast, 2 pieces of toast with butter and a cup of black coffee, but found he could barely eat. He dressed carefully in his best suit, the navy blue one he'd worn to every important school event for the past decade. It was showing its age, the fabric slightly shiny at the elbows, the style a few years out of date, but it was clean and pressed. His late wife Martha had always said he looked distinguished in it. The mirror reflected a man who had lived a full life of service, silver hair neatly combed, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that showed the years of writing equations on whiteboards and grading thousands of papers. He wasn't tall or imposing, but there was a gentle dignity about him that his students had always respected. Bob pulled out his old leather suitcase, a retirement gift from his teaching colleagues at Roosevelt High. It wasn't expensive, but it had been chosen with love. Inside, he carefully packed his few good clothes, a photo of Martha, and a small wrapped gift for his grandson, a wooden toy train he'd made himself in his garage workshop. As he waited for the taxi, Bob thought about all the students who had passed through his classroom. There was Maria, who at Ron Artenauter's Los Angeles International Airport was unlike anything Bob had ever experienced. The terminal stretched endlessly in every direction, filled with sophisticated travelers who moved with practiced ease through the maze of check-in counters, security lines, and departure gates. The noise was overwhelming, announcements echoing from speakers, conversations in multiple languages, the rumble of luggage wheels on polished floors. Bob felt immediately out of place. Around him, business travelers in expensive suits spoke confidently into Bluetooth headsets about million-dollar deals. Families with designer luggage herded their children toward gates for flights to Paris, Tokyo, and London. Young people with backpacks and carefree attitudes headed off on adventures to exotic destinations. He approached the check-in counter, his economy class ticket printed on his home computer and carefully folded in his wallet. The airline representative was a young woman, probably about the same age as his former students, with perfectly styled hair and makeup. "Good morning," Bob said politely. "I'm checking in for Flight 447 to New York." She took his ID and boarding pass without looking up from her computer screen. Her nails were manicured, her uniform crisp and professional. After a moment, she glanced at him briefly. "Economy class, seat 32B. That's a middle seat in the back of the aircraft," she said in a tone that suggested middle seats in economy were somehow unfortunate. "Security is that way, and your gate is B7. The flight doesn't board for another 2 hours. Thank you. Is there somewhere I can wait comfortably?" "Well, there are seats at the gate, or—" She looked at his modest appearance, taking in the older suit and well-worn shoes. "There's the first-class lounge, but that requires a first-class ticket or elite status membership." Bob thanked her and made his way through security, a process that left him feeling more confused and exposed than ever. He removed his shoes, his belt, emptied his pockets, and submitted to scanning procedures that seemed designed for a different generation. Younger travelers moved through the process with practiced efficiency, while Bob fumbled with unfamiliar protocols. As Bob wandered through the terminal looking for his gate, he passed the entrance to the first-class lounge. Through the glass doors, he could see a different world, one of leather chairs, quiet conversations, and complimentary refreshments. Well-dressed passengers sat reading newspapers, working on laptops, or simply enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. A businessman, in a suit that probably cost more than Bob's monthly pension, brushed past him impatiently, speaking loudly into his phone about stock options and quarterly projections. A woman in designer clothes and jewelry clicked past in heels that cost more than Bob spent on groceries in a month. Bob found a hard plastic chair near his gate and sat down heavily. The terminal was loud and chaotic around him. Children were crying, announcements were constantly echoing overhead, and the smell of fast food and coffee created an overwhelming sensory experience. He watched the parade of travelers and began to feel like an outsider looking into a world he didn't understand. These people belonged here. They knew the language of air travel, the unspoken rules of airport etiquette, the casual confidence that came with frequent flying. An elderly woman sat down next to him, also looking overwhelmed. "First time flying?" she asked kindly. "Yes," Bob admitted. "You?" "Oh no, I fly all the time to visit my children, but I remember my first flight 30 years ago. It's scary and exciting all at once." They chatted for a while, and Bob learned she had been a nurse for 40 years before retiring. Like him, she had spent her career in service to others, and like him, she was traveling economy class to see family. "The thing about people like us," she said wisely, "is that we spent our lives taking care of others instead of accumulating wealth, but we've got something money can't buy, the satisfaction of knowing we made a difference." About an hour before his flight, Bob decided to explore the terminal a bit more. He was fascinated by the shops, the restaurants, and the general bustle of international travel. As he walked, he noticed the first-class lounge again, and this time decided to take a closer look. The entrance was elegant, polished wood, soft lighting, and a sign that read, "Premium Passengers Only." Through the glass, Bob could see the serene environment inside. It looked so much more peaceful than the chaotic main terminal. Thinking it might just be a quieter waiting area, and not fully understanding the class distinctions of air travel, Bob approached the entrance. "Excuse me, sir," called out a young security guard who looked barely old enough to have graduated from high school. He was tall, fit, and wore his uniform with the authority of someone who took his job very seriously. "Yes," Bob replied politely. "This area is restricted to first-class passengers and elite status members only. May I see your boarding pass?" Bob handed over his economy ticket, suddenly feeling foolish. The guard examined it with the thoroughness of a customs official. "Sir, this is an economy class ticket. This lounge is for premium passengers only. You'll need to use the general seating area in the main terminal." The guard's tone wasn't deliberately cruel, but there was a condescending quality to it that made Bob feel small. Other passengers walking past began to notice the interaction. A businessman in an expensive suit looked at Bob with mild irritation, as if his presence were somehow disrupting the natural order of things. "I'm sorry," Bob said quietly. "I didn't realize. I was just looking for a place to sit quietly." "No problem, sir, but you understand we have to maintain these standards for our premium customers. There are plenty of seats available in the main terminal." As Bob walked away, his cheeks burning with embarrassment, he heard the guard radio to someone, had another economy passenger trying to get into first class, handled it. Bob found himself thinking about his classroom, where every student, regardless of their family's income, their clothes or their background, was treated with equal respect and dignity. He had never made a child feel ashamed for not having the latest sneakers or the most expensive school supplies. He had always believed that a person's worth wasn't measured by their material possessions, but here, in this gleaming temple to modern travel, those values seemed to mean nothing. As Bob returned to his plastic chair in the main terminal, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the two worlds of the airport. In the general seating area, families with modest means entertained restless children, elderly people dozed in uncomfortable chairs, and budget travelers made meals out of fast food and vending machine snacks. Meanwhile, premium passengers glided through the terminal with ease. They had dedicated check-in counters with no lines, expedited security screening, and access to quiet lounges with comfortable seating and complimentary food and drinks. They boarded first, sat in seats with extra legroom, and were served real meals on actual plates. Bob understood that the airline was a business and that people who paid more should receive better service. But the experience of being turned away from the lounge had stung more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't about wanting luxury, it was about being made to feel like he didn't belong, like he was somehow less worthy of basic courtesy and comfort. He thought about his students again, particularly those who had come from low-income families. How many times had they felt this same sting of exclusion? How many times had they been made to feel that their worth was determined by their economic circumstances rather than their character, their potential, or their contributions to society? A young mother sat nearby, trying to keep her toddler entertained while juggling a baby and multiple bags. She looked exhausted and stressed, clearly traveling alone with two small children. Bob smiled at the toddler, who giggled and played peekaboo with him over the seat. "Thank you," the mother said gratefully. "It's been a long day." "I was a teacher for 40 years, Bob replied. "I have a soft spot for little ones." "A teacher? That's wonderful. My daughter just started kindergarten. Teachers like you are heroes to families like mine." Bob felt a warmth in his chest that no first-class lounge could have provided. This was his value, not in money or status, but in the countless small moments of connection and care he had shared with young people and their families. The flight and the revelation. When Flight 447 finally began boarding, Bob watched as first-class passengers were called first, walking past everyone else to board the plane immediately. Then business class, then premium economy, and finally his group, general economy boarding. He found his seat, 32B, wedged between a businessman who immediately put on noise-canceling headphones and opened his laptop, and a college student who seemed more interested in her phone than conversation. The seat was narrow, the legroom minimal, and Bob's knees pressed against the seat in front of him. As the plane filled up, Bob noticed the flight attendants treating first-class passengers with special attention, offering them drinks before takeoff, hanging up their coats, and addressing them by name. Economy passengers were largely ignored until after takeoff, but Bob didn't mind. He was finally flying, finally on his way to meet his grandson. He looked out the small window as the plane taxied toward the runway, marveling at the sight of other aircraft, the busy ground crews, and the sprawling city of Los Angeles spreading toward the horizon. The engines revved, and Bob felt the incredible force as the plane accelerated down the runway. When they lifted off, he pressed his face to the window like a child, watching the ground fall away beneath them. Cars became toy-sized, buildings shrank to dollhouse proportions, and soon they were soaring above the clouds. It was magical. Once they reached cruising altitude, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, with the usual announcements about flight time, weather, and altitude. But then the pilot's tone changed, becoming more personal. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Michael Rodriguez speaking. Before we continue our service today, I have a very special announcement to make." Bob looked up from his magazine, mildly curious. "We have an extraordinary passenger with us today, my former high school mathematics teacher, Mr. Robert Johnson, who taught at Roosevelt High School in Riverside, California, for 40 years before retiring this past June." Bob's heart stopped. The magazine fell from his hands. Around him, passengers began looking around the cabin, trying to identify this teacher. "Mr. Johnson taught me advanced calculus and trigonometry in 1998 and 1999, when I was a senior at Roosevelt High. I was a struggling student from a single-parent household, working part-time jobs to help my mom pay rent, and frankly, I thought I was going nowhere in life." The businessman next to Bob removed his headphones. The college student looked up from her phone. Throughout the cabin, passengers were listening intently, but Mr. Johnson saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. He stayed after school with me every Tuesday and Thursday for an entire semester, helping me not just with math, but teaching me that I could achieve anything I set my mind to. When I told him I dreamed of becoming a pilot, he didn't laugh. He helped me understand the mathematics and physics that would make that dream possible. Bob's eyes filled with tears. Michael Rodriguez. He remembered him now, a quiet, serious boy who sat in the third row and always stayed after everyone else had left. His mother cleaned offices at night to make ends meet. Michael had been so bright, but so convinced he wasn't college material. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Rodriguez continued, I want everyone on this aircraft to know that we are flying safely today because of teachers like Mr. Johnson. Every calculation I make, every flight plan I plot, every decision I make in this cockpit traces back to the foundation he gave me in mathematics and, more importantly, in believing in myself. The entire cabin turned to look at Bob, who sat frozen in his middle seat, overwhelmed by the moment. Mr. Johnson, I know you're somewhere back there in economy class, and I want to say something I should have said 25 years ago. Thank you for changing my life. The cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Passengers were reaching across aisles to shake Bob's hand. The businessman next to him removed his headphones completely and introduced himself. The college student asked if she could take a selfie with him. You're the teacher, she exclaimed. That's so cool. I'm studying to be a teacher myself. Before Bob could fully process what was happening, the cockpit door opened and Captain Rodriguez appeared in the aisle. He was tall and confident in his crisp pilot's uniform, with the kind of presence that commanded respect. But when he saw Bob, his professional demeanor melted away and he became that earnest teenager again. Mr. Johnson, is that really you? Bob stood up shakily and Michael embraced him right there in the narrow aisle of the economy section. Michael Rodriguez, Bob said, his voice thick with emotion. My goodness, look at you. You've grown up to be exactly what I knew you could become. Sir, I can't believe you're on my flight. What are the odds? I'm flying to New York to meet my grandson for the first time. This is actually my first flight ever. Captain Rodriguez looked shocked. Your first flight? Mr. Johnson, you've spent 40 years educating young people, and you've never experienced the miracle of flight. Well, on a teacher's salary, Bob began. No, sir. Not today, not on my watch. What happened next was unlike anything Bob could have imagined. Captain Rodriguez spoke briefly with the flight attendants, and suddenly Bob found himself being escorted to the first-class cabin. Sir, we have an empty seat in first class, the head flight attendant announced. Captain Rodriguez has requested that you be our guest for the remainder of the flight. Bob protested. Oh, I couldn't. I didn't pay for first class. Mr. Johnson, Michael said firmly. You paid for this upgrade 40 years ago when you invested your time and energy in a kid who didn't believe in himself. This is long overdue. The first-class cabin was everything Bob had glimpsed through the lounge windows: spacious leather seats that reclined into beds, personal entertainment systems, and flight attendants who treated every passenger like royalty. But more than the luxury, it was the respect and recognition that overwhelmed him. Passengers in first class, who had paid thousands of dollars for their seats, stood up to applaud as he was seated. They wanted to hear about his teaching career, about the students he had helped, about his philosophy of education. You know, said an elderly businessman in the seat across from Bob, I run a Fortune 500 company. But what you've done, shaping young minds for 40 years, that's far more important than anything I've ever accomplished in business. Michael returned to spend more time with Bob, bringing him into the cockpit to see the incredible array of instruments and controls. Mr. Johnson, everything you see here, the navigation systems, the flight computers, the communication equipment, it's all based on mathematical principles you taught me. Every time I calculate our position, our fuel consumption, our altitude adjustments, I'm using the foundation you gave me. Bob was amazed by the technology, but he was more amazed by the man Michael had become. Confident, professional, responsible for the safety of hundreds of passengers, yet still humble enough to remember and honor his high school teacher. You know what I remember most about your class? Michael asked as they looked out at the clouds below. It wasn't just the math, it was that you treated every student like they mattered. Rich kids, poor kids, smart kids, struggling kids. You saw potential in all of us. That's because you all did have potential, Bob replied. My job was just to help you see it. On a red spread through the aircraft about the story, something beautiful began to happen. Passengers started sharing their own stories about teachers who had influenced their lives. The college student studying education talked about the third-grade teacher who had encouraged her love of reading. A doctor in first class spoke about his high school chemistry teacher who had sparked his interest in medicine. A young mother described the kindergarten teacher who had helped her shy daughter find her confidence. The flight became an impromptu celebration of education and the teachers who had shaped their lives. Bob found himself at the center of conversations about the importance of public education, the challenges facing teachers, and the difference one dedicated educator can make. "You know what's wrong with our society," said a tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley. "We worship celebrities and athletes, but we don't value the people who actually build the foundation of our civilization." Teachers like Mr. Johnson, a flight attendant who had been listening to the conversations, approached Bob with tears in her eyes. "Sir, I just wanted you to know, I have 2 children in elementary school, and I pray they have teachers like you, teachers who see them as individuals, who believe in them even when they don't believe in themselves." By the time they began their descent into JFK Airport, Bob had received dozens of business cards from passengers who wanted to stay in touch, invitations to visit their children's schools as a guest speaker, and even a job offer from a private school in Manhattan. But more than anything, he had received something he hadn't felt in years: recognition for the value of his life's work. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude our flight today, I want to remind everyone of something important. We live in a society that often measures success by wealth, status symbols, and material possessions. But the most valuable person on this aircraft today paid for his ticket in economy class. The entire plane was quiet, listening. Mr. Robert Johnson spent 40 years investing in young people, many of whom came from backgrounds where success seemed impossible. He didn't get rich doing it. He didn't become famous. He didn't accumulate luxury possessions or status symbols, but he changed thousands of lives. Bob felt tears running down his cheeks. I am just one of those lives. There are Michael Rodriguez's all over this country: pilots, doctors, engineers, teachers, scientists, entrepreneurs, who are living their dreams because a teacher like Mr. Johnson believed in them when no one else did. The applause was thunderous and sustained. Passengers stood up, many of them crying, giving Bob a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. As they deplaned, Captain Rodriguez walked with Bob to the gate where his daughter Lisa was waiting. When she saw her father walking with the pilot in his uniform, she looked confused. "Dad, what's going on?" Bob introduced her to Michael, and as the story unfolded, Lisa began crying too. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she said, hugging him tightly. "I always knew you were special, but I don't think I really understood how special until today." Captain Rodriguez presented Bob with a gift, a pair of pilot's wings, and a handwritten letter. "Mr. Johnson, these wings represent every flight I've ever flown safely, but more than that, they represent the dreams you helped me achieve. I want you to have them as a small token of my gratitude." He also handed Bob an envelope. "And this is from the airline. When I told my supervisor your story, the company wanted to express their appreciation. You have unlimited first-class travel privileges for life. A teacher who has given so much to society should never have to sit in the back of the plane again." As Bob finally held his grandson for the first time, surrounded by his family in Lisa's beautiful Manhattan apartment, he reflected on the extraordinary day. He had started the morning as an invisible retiree, dismissed at the airport lounge, overlooked by society, traveling in the cheapest seat available. He had ended the day as a celebrated hero, honored by hundreds of strangers, recognized for his life's work. But the most profound realization was that nothing about him had actually changed during that flight. He was the same man who had been turned away from the first-class lounge. He had the same modest background, the same worn suit, the same teacher's pension. What had changed was that people finally saw his true value. "You know what's funny?" Bob said to Lisa, as they watched little Tommy sleep in his arms. "I spent 40 years trying to teach my students that their worth wasn't determined by their circumstances, their appearance, or their family's money, but I had forgotten that lesson myself." "What do you mean, Dad?" "I let those people at the airport make me feel small and unworthy, but I've always been worthy. Every teacher is worthy. Every person who dedicates their life to serving others is worthy." Lisa smiled through her tears. "And now the whole world knows it." Captain Rodriguez had shared it on Facebook. Passengers had posted about it on Instagram and Twitter, and soon news outlets were picking up the story of the retired teacher who was honored at 35,000 feet. Bob received thousands of letters from teachers around the country who felt inspired by his recognition. He heard from former students he hadn't spoken to in decades, many of whom were now successful professionals who wanted to thank him for his influence on their lives. Most importantly, he received letters from current students who had heard his story and were motivated to work harder, dream bigger, and appreciate their teachers more. The airline featured Bob in a national advertising campaign about the unsung heroes who travel on their planes every day. The campaign won awards and helped change public perception about the value of teachers and other service professionals. Roosevelt High School named their new mathematics wing the Robert Johnson Mathematics Center, and Bob was invited back as a guest lecturer, sharing his philosophy that every student has unlimited potential waiting to be discovered. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the scholarship fund established in Bob's name by his former students. Led by Captain Rodriguez, hundreds of his former students contributed to create full college scholarships for students from low-income families who showed academic promise but lacked financial resources. Mr. Johnson taught us that the best way to honor a teacher is to pass on what they gave us, Captain Rodriguez said at the scholarship fund's launch. He invested in us, and now we're investing in the next generation. Bob Johnson's story reminds us of an eternal truth that society often forgets. Real value isn't measured by wealth, status symbols, or material possessions. The most important people in our society are often the ones who serve others quietly, without recognition or fanfare. Teachers, nurses, social workers, firefighters, police officers, and countless other service professionals dedicate their lives to making the world better. They don't get rich doing it. They don't become celebrities. They don't accumulate luxury possessions, but they change lives. They build the foundation of civilization. They invest in human potential and create the future. Bob's moment of recognition at LAX was beautiful, not because it was unique, but because it was so rare. Every day, thousands of unsung heroes like Bob Johnson travel through airports, eat in restaurants, shop in stores, and move through society without the recognition they deserve. His story challenges us to look beyond appearances, beyond economic status, beyond the superficial markers of success, and see the true heroes who walk among us. Because sometimes, the person sitting in economy class has given more to the world than anyone in first class ever will, and sometimes, the most valuable passenger on the plane is the one who almost wasn't allowed in the lounge. The teacher's legacy lives on in every life they touch, in every dream they help make possible, and in every student who grows up to change the world. This story serves as a reminder that in a world obsessed with wealth and status, the true measure of a life well lived is not what we accumulate for ourselves, but what we give to others. Mr. Robert Johnson's 40 years of teaching created ripples that spread across generations, touching thousands of lives in ways that money could never measure. His recognition at 35,000 feet was not just a heartwarming moment, it was a symbol of the recognition that all of our unsung heroes deserve, and a reminder that the most important work in society is often done by those who seek no recognition for doing it.